Today we're going to be focusing on coping with anxiety in difficult times. And it's part of a series called Birkbeck Inspires, of a number of talks that I had one last week, and there'll be some more in the coming weeks. This is called part one because my colleague Ana da Cunha, who's an educational psychologist, is going to be doing a coping with anxiety in difficult times part two, children and young people, in a couple of weeks. So it seemed appropriate that we should divide it into two halves. So in terms of the subject matter that we're going to be talking about tonight, clearly it merits a much longer time than we've got. But I'm going to do my best to give you a sense of some strategies that you might use either now or at some stage in the 20 minutes or so that we've got together. So as you may have heard me, if you were with me last week, you'll have heard me say that one of the outstanding features of the last 3 or 4 months is the range of emotions that we have experienced, which are atypical of our society. So we've had fear, I'm sure. We've had, certainly to adapt to change, an awful lot of uncertainty and a lot of worry on a variety of fronts. And for some people, there's also been illness and bereavement to contend with. And these things are not conducive to good mental health. I think it's important to say that stress and anxiety is an entirely normal response to a situation like this. And I say this because in speaking to people over the last few weeks, I've lost count of the number of people who've said that they were feeling really stressed and anxious and sort of surprised, saying, I'm really surprised at myself. And I thought that was quite interesting because I don't think it's at all surprising. I think the situation right now is absolutely one that would give anyone stress and anxiety. As you may have, if you were with me last week, you'll have heard me say that one of the things that are an outstanding feature is the fact that we have taken activities that in the past we would have felt completely fine about, and suddenly these activities have become fearful and uncertain. And I think it's really stark how really very ordinary things have become seen as problematic. We talked about the fact that the general perception is that things will take a long time to get back to normal. And I think it's for that reason that it's really important for us to think about how we might manage the feelings that we have, because they're going to be with us for a long time. I promise not my sides are the same as last week, but they have the same starting place. So one of the things that we also talked about was this notion of uncertainty and its impact on our mental being. And uncertainty normally comes in 3 forms: an assessment of the probability or risk of the danger that we're under, the ambiguity of the situation, and the complexity of the situation. And the stark thing about where we are now is that actually it sort of meets the criteria for uncertainty on all fronts. So whilst some uncertainty is actually essential, and life that has no uncertainty in it is actually seen as very dull, and actually lack of some uncertainty in life is perceived as actually not very pleasant at all. It's boring. People get very bored. So we actually need some uncertainty as a stimulant to action, but for very good reasons. We've evolved to try and reduce uncertainty in our lives, and as a consequence, most of us resist disorder and uncertainty. And that's because it is in our natures to be monitoring our environment and making judgments about what's safe and what isn't, so we keep ourselves safe. We are constantly protecting the world and trying to come up with an assessment of how dangerous it is. So stress that comes from the uncertainty that we've just described is described as a situation or an event that's seen as aversive, in other words, to be avoided, and that elicits a response which has its toll on us, either physiologically, either biologically, or psychologically, because we see it as being outside of our comfort zone to actually deal with. And it provokes what is termed a subjective state by the physical or mental tension. And it's called subjective because the same event will have quite a strong impact on one person and possibly a much less strong impact on somebody else. So, for instance, some years ago, I was in a car with a friend of mine who is a doctor in A&E, and we came by an accident, and our physiological responses would have been very different to that stressor. She became my professional self, and I tried to keep a very outwardly calm appearance, but actually inside I was really very stressed. And I constrained myself to just being her assistant as best as I could. So although it was the same event, our subjective response to it was very much dependent on what we saw as our capacity to deal with it. Subjective, it's because our sense of our own capacity in any particular moment actually alters the extent to which we feel stressed or less stressed. The interesting thing about stress is that it actually has a massive and complex physiological response. So it goes by the rather astonishing name of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And effectively what that means when exposed to a stressor, we have both a nervous and a hormone response that floods through our body that allows us to effectively prepare to fight or flee the aggressor. So you need to think about it in terms of our rather ourselves many thousands of years ago. If we were faced with a saber-toothed tiger, that everything would be geared up towards either fighting or running as fast as possible away from this. And it's a really adaptive response to an immediate danger, because it allows us to prepare our bodies for what is effectively a really potentially traumatic circumstance. And this particular set of responses is amazing. It changes the way our body clots. It draws blood and resources away from all the non-essentials bar survival. And the thing that floods our bodies are the most well-known aspects of that are adrenaline and cortisol that I'm sure that you've heard about. Now, perfectly normal response. Indeed, we've evolved it for a very good reason. It was only ever meant to be for a short-term reaction. It was meant to be danger, fight or flight, and then our body puts all its measures into countering all the effects that cortisol and adrenaline and other things have actually created. The difficulty is that if you hold this response for a very long time, it starts to have an impact on our physical and mental health. For the reasons that I've described, it sort of subverts all the energy that we have and gears it towards a particular part of us, and there's lots of other things that it just doesn't do as well, that I kind of get left behind it. And so there are a number of physical and mental symptoms: and irritability, anger, fatigue, because it's actually really fatiguing to be experiencing this, muscle pain, because we tend to hold ourselves quite rigidly, and then digestive troubles and also difficulty sleeping. Because clearly, when you are in fight or flight, your digestion is not your first priority. But we also know that chronic stress impacts on brain structure and immune function and cardiovascular and mental health. So because this is such a whiz-through, for those of you who are interested, I'm happy to share my slides, and all of these links go to other things that you can read more about it if you wish. So when we talk about stress and anxiety, the first thing to say is that anxiety is a multifaceted thing. It's not just one thing. Today we're going to focus on a sort of a general and generalized anxiety disorder rather than specifics. But there are lots and lots of different types of anxiety. So whereas stress is normally the response to a perceived threat, anxiety can often be a reaction to stress, but what happens is it sort of persists long after the initial threat is gone. And the definition of anxiety that we're working with here is an emotion that is characterized by this retention of tension, by worried thoughts, and the physical changes that we've described. And the key thing is that it needs to be disproportionate to the actual presence or likelihood of threat. So if you are anxious and the situation merits it, then the feeling may be anxiety, but it's not an anxiety disorder. The issue that is really at hand, where it becomes problematic, is when either the issue doesn't resolve or where the response to it becomes disproportionate to the size of the actual threat. The sorts of things we talked about, as I've said, are fatigue, muscle pain, digestive troubles, and difficulty sleeping. And then we also have this kind of range of symptoms that are psychological and emotional ones. Irritability is a common one. Emotionality is another common one, where people are quick to both, people get very emotional. They're upset more easily. This notion of persistent worry, but also sort of a sense of kind of the hopelessness of a situation potentially, and also intrusive thoughts where you are thinking about the issue quite a lot. So in considering, and actually in the discussions that we have now, it's really important that you consider whether this is a new thing or whether it's a pre-existing anxiety that you already hold, because I think that tells you a little bit about what strategies you need to put into place. There's also an issue about severity, how much it impacts on your daily life, and how long you've had this difficulty, you or anybody else that you're trying to support. And I think the crucial thing is to ask yourself whether you should ask for help. So I should say that a lot of what we're going to be talking about in terms of strategy is very much about mild to moderate anxiety. But I think once it goes beyond the moderate anxiety, it really is a question you may be thinking about whether you need to ask for help. And then the other types of strategies that we have are really about whether you want something to have an immediate effect, and those that have an immediate effect tend to be the ones that deal with symptoms rather than causes. And then you have some medium and longer term strategies that can actually get to support you to and fundamentally change kind of the response that you are having, but also may mean that you have some lifestyle changes that allows you to be better prepared to deal with. Strategies. So sometimes the simplest strategies are actually the most effective ones. So relaxation and mindfulness strategies have been shown to actually have a really powerful effect, especially in terms of the immediate, because you can have some strategies, and I'll tell you about a couple that I really like, that automatically start to help you with things like reducing the immediate symptoms like your heart rate or muscle tension. But what's interesting about these is that they will also work in the medium and the longer term. So there is really good evidence that a constant practice of either relaxation or mindfulness techniques can actually make you feel more able to cope with stress in the longer term. So people who take part in these kinds of activities on a regular basis describe themselves as less stressed. The links, there are some further links here which you can utilize if you want to read up more about it. So one of my immediate ones is one that I mentioned last week. It really is one that is kind of both mindfulness and kind of cognitive. Often the reason that people feel quite stressed is because their thoughts are kind of very fast and unraveling. So this is a moment where you actively stop and you try to root yourself into the ground. You feel your feet. If you notice that most of the time we lose kind of a sense of our own bodies, we forget that, you know, we've got our feet on the floor until we actually direct our attention to it. So you feel your feet and you focus on your breathing, and you, in that moment, feel, and you let go of some of the thoughts that may be alarming you. So this is another one of my favorite ones. I've mentioned it. If you've been to one of my talks, you'll know that I'm a huge fan. This is called the 3-minute breathing space. It comes from a particular guide, which I think for mindfulness, which is written by a psychologist called Mark Williams. This is available free on the internet, and the link to it goes here. It's literally that, what it says. It's a 3-minute breathing space, and it can be, I've often used it at the start of exams for my students, and it works a treat. It's a very helpful thing. 3 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but it can be really powerful. So we also have some cognitive strategies. I thought I'd tell you which strategies. So cognitive meaning thinking strategies. So we are, we sort of think that we are intellectual thinking beings who feel, but actually the longer I live, the more I think that we are feeling beings who think. So and this is a moment where we try and use our thoughts to control our emotions. So first of all, I'll just tell you that rumination, so that is the persistent thinking about the same thing, and self-blame is really linked to really quite poor outcomes in terms of the persistence of stress. And this goes back a very long way. As you can see, this particular reference goes back 30 years now. And self-blame is also really very poor, as a very poor mechanism, and yet we all do this. In contrast to that, acceptance, so both acceptance of the feeling that you have and acceptance of the situation, allowing yourself the moment for hope and optimism, that is much more likely to be to improve anxiety and anxiety response. So positive reappraisal is a moment where you try and look for the good in a situation, and that doesn't mean being unrealistic. It's an active process that means that you look for the good. And interestingly, even if you don't find much, the active process of looking for the good is in itself helpful. Putting into perspective the situation, and I think especially getting a sense of control, of knowing the limits of your control, which is also part of acceptance. Acceptance is sometimes, and putting into perspective, is a moment where you go, actually, this event is outside of my control, so I'm going to try and not try to control the things that I can't. With a refocus on planning and planning your own, the elements that you are able to control. Now, these as activities that you actively participate in are absolutely associated with with strong responses in perceived stress and anxiety. So physical exercise, I've said steptoe because it's one of the earliest ones I remember, but actually there is so much research that says a little bit of exercise that is, it doesn't have to be massive, it can just be a walk, it can be, you can build up a little bit of a walk, a stroll, and then a faster walk, but a little bit of moderate exercise is so powerful. There's been some research that says for mild to moderate anxiety, exercise can be as effective as medication. And then social support, so reaching out to a friend and having a cup of tea with them can be really effective. And interestingly, so is giving support to a friend. But the research is clear that where you are giving support or receiving support, the most effective way of that having a really strong response is for it to be a typical arrangement. So in other words, giving support to a friend who doesn't offer it back is not useful, actually can increase your stress. But having a mutual relationship where you support them and they support you is really good. So there are some lifestyle changes that are also fundamental in terms of anxiety. So diet is so strongly associated with our capacity to deal with anxiety. Really good evidence there. As is a reduction in interaction with not just the media, but just the news about the thing that's causing you anxiety in general. So a withdrawal and giving yourself a bit of tech-free time, that's really useful. Leaving yourself time to do things you enjoy, also fundamentally important. I had a lecturer when I was an undergraduate who's behaviorist by inclination, and he said one of the key things about having an issue with anxiety or with stress is that people who are anxious tend to behave in an anxious way, in the sense that they focus so much on the issue that they forget to give themselves time to just be and enjoy and do nice things. And that's always struck me as a really interesting idea. But finding time for the things that give you pleasure actually is a really good way to give yourself some time off from the worry. And then I think it's also important to know when to seek help, because there is, I think, if it's needed, therapy and even medication can be highly effective.